Dave's wrist and twisting it with a sickening crack. The gun clattered to the floor, and the next thing Marcus knew, his world was spinning as Tyrone slammed the butt of his gun into Dave's skull. Dave crumpled like a ragdoll, and Marcus's vision went red. He lunged for the fallen weapon, but one of the gang members was already on him, punching and kicking. The world went dark, and he felt himself being dragged out of the store. He woke up to the sound of sirens and the cold pavement against his cheek. The store was a mess, and Dave was gone. The funeral was a blur of sad faces and whispered condolences. Marcus felt like he was watching it all from a distance, like he was in a movie. But this was real. This was his life, and he knew what he had to do. He couldn't let Dave's death be in vain. He couldn't let the gangsters win. The next day, Marcus went to the gun store. The clerk eyed him suspiciously, but he had the money, and he had the ID that said he was 21. He bought the Mac-11 and a box of ammo, his hands shaking as he stuffed them into his backpack. It was time to take the fight to them. It was time for Reconciliation Day. He waited until the sun had dipped below the horizon, the streetlights casting eerie shadows on the pavement. Then he set out, his heart racing. The first target was the convenience store, now a silent monument to the man who'd been a father figure to him. He approached the alley where they always hung out, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear their laughter, the sound of bottles breaking. His hand went to the gun in his backpack, his palm slick with sweat. As he rounded the corner, the sight that greeted him was like a punch to the gut. Tyrone and his gang were there, loitering, smoking, acting like they owned the place. Marcus felt the weight of the Mac-11, the cold metal pressing against his back. He took a deep breath and stepped into the light, the time for talking over. The gang members looked up, surprise etched on their faces. For a moment, the world was still, the only sound the distant wail of a siren. Then Tyrone's eyes narrowed, and he sneered. "Look what the cat dragged in. The little hero." Marcus didn't say a word. He pulled the Mac-11 from his backpack and leveled it at Tyrone. The gangsters' laughter died in their throats, their smirks fading into looks of fear. The power was intoxicating. "This is for Dave," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. "And for everyone else you've hurt." The gun roared to life, and the alley was filled with the stench of gunpowder and the screams of the dying. Bullets flew, and bodies fell. It was chaos, but Marcus was in control, his eyes cold and focused. The gangsters had taken his innocence, his sense of belonging, and now he was taking it back. The world had made him a monster, but he'd be a monster with a purpose. As the echoes of Marcus's opening salvo filled the alley, the gangsters reacted with a mix of shock and rage. They fumbled for their own weapons, the smirks on their faces replaced by snarls of fear and hatred. Tyrone was the first to recover, pulling out a gleaming handgun and pointing it at Marcus. The sound of gunfire erupted as the gang returned fire, bullets ricocheting off the brick walls and shattering the quiet night. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest as he emptied the Mac-11's magazine into the group, his movements a blur of rage and determination. The muzzle flash illuminated his face, casting stark shadows on the terrified expressions of his enemies. Each pull of the trigger brought a twisted sense of satisfaction, a release of the anger and frustration that had been festering inside him for so long. The gangsters' shots went wild, their fear making them sloppy. Marcus took cover behind a dumpster, his backpack bulging with the promise of more destruction. He slammed a fresh magazine into the Mac-11, the metallic click a sweet sound in the cacophony of gunfire. His mind was clear, his intent unwavering. This was his moment, his chance to show them all what he was made of. He leapfrogged from cover to cover, firing in short, controlled bursts. The gangsters tried to scatter, but they were trapped, their usual bravado replaced by the desperate scrabble of survival. Marcus moved like a ghost, his training paying off as he took them out one by one. The alley was a battleground, and he was the angel of retribution sent to cleanse it of their corruption. As his ammo dwindled, Marcus felt a strange serenity wash over him. This was what he'd been born for, to bring order to the chaos they'd created. His last few bullets found their marks, and the gangsters fell, their laughter silenced forever. The alley was a scene of carnage, a testament to the power of one man's vendetta. But the battle wasn't over. The thumping bass of a rap song grew louder, echoing from a house nearby. Marcus knew they had backup, that the night wasn't through with him yet. He ducked into the shadows, his eyes scanning the alley for his next target. Spotting a car parked in a garage, he took a deep breath and made his move. The smell of gasoline was faint but unmistakable. He pulled out a rag, soaked it in the gas puddling under the car, and shoved it into the gas tank. The fabric caught on the edge, and with a flick of his big lighter, he ignited the fuse of his makeshift bomb. The music grew louder, the bass thumping in time with his racing heart. He waited, his handgun at the ready, his eyes locked on the garage door. The gangsters had to come out eventually. And when they did, he'd be waiting. The door burst open, and the first to emerge was met with a barrage of bullets from the Mac 11. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. Marcus felt a grim satisfaction as he watched the life drain from the thug's eyes. But then the unthinkable happened. The car exploded in a fiery ball of death, the garage door blowing off its hinges and sending a shockwave that knocked Marcus off his feet. He rolled, the heat searing his skin, and came up firing. The world was a blur of fire and shrapnel, the night air thick with the acrid scent of burning rubber and screams. The gangsters were scattered, their faces twisted in a mix of fear and anger. Marcus staggered to his feet, his ears ringing. The handgun was his only weapon now, and he knew it wasn't enough. He could see the glint of their eyes in the flickering firelight, the muzzles of their guns pointing at him like the barrels of a dozen snakes. But he had the element of surprise on his side, and he used it to the fullest. He rolled behind the burning wreckage of the car, the heat at his back, and took aim. The first few shots were perfect, dropping 2 more of them with clinical precision. But then the world spun as a bullet slammed into his shoulder. Pain exploded through him, and he stumbled, dropping the Mac 11. The handgun was all he had left. He fired blindly, feeling the recoil with each shot. They were closing in, their shadows dancing in the flames like demons from hell. And then the unthinkable happened. One of the gangsters had seen him, had his sights set on him. Marcus knew he had to act fast. He ducked behind a trash can, the bullets peppering the metal with a symphony of deadly music. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his eyes searched for an escape. But there was none. He was trapped, surrounded by the very people he'd sworn to destroy. Through the smoke and flames, he saw the biggest, toughest one of them all lumbering towards him, a grin on his face that was more menacing than any mask. This was the one they called the Beast, a moniker earned from his brutal ways and towering frame. Marcus knew this was his moment. He had to end this, end it now. With a roar that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his soul, Marcus leaped shrugged over the trash can, his handgun blazing. The Beast took a hit to the chest, staggered back, but didn't go down. Marcus felt a strange kinship with Bickle in that moment, the two of them fighting the same fight. He aimed again, the gun bucking in his hand, and fired. This time, the Beast dropped like a sack of bricks, a surprised look etched on his face as he stared up at the sky, his chest a mess of blood and torn fabric. Marcus stepped over the fallen gangster, his eyes locked on the last of them, the one who'd shot him. He felt the warm trickle of blood down his arm, but the pain was distant, overshadowed by the rage that fueled him. He limped closer, each step echoing in the alley like the ticking of a doomsday clock. The final gangster was cowering, his gun forgotten on the ground. Marcus leaned down, his breath hot and ragged, and whispered, "You think you're so tough, hiding behind your crew? Well, now it's just you and me." The gangster's eyes were wide with fear, but Marcus saw the flicker of defiance. He knew the type. They didn't go down easy. But Marcus was ready. He had the taste of victory in his mouth, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. He raised the gun, the muzzle an inch from the gangster's forehead. "This is for my dad," he growled. "This is for Dave. And this," he spat, "is for every kid who's ever been bullied by scum like you." The gangster's eyes rolled back, and he opened his mouth to scream, but it was too late. Marcus pulled the trigger, the shot echoing through the alley like a final judgment. The gangster's body jerked once, twice, and then went still. Marcus felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, the anger that had driven him now replaced by a cold, empty numbness. He'd done it. He'd made them pay. But the world had other plans. The pain in his shoulder grew, the warmth of his own blood now a river down his side. He looked down, and his vision swam. He'd been hit too many times, his body had taken too much. He staggered back, the handgun slipping from his grip, and slumped against the alley wall. The world grew dim, the sounds of sirens distant and unimportant. With one final, desperate gasp, Marcus whispered, "This is what you get," and then the darkness took him. The alley was silent, save for the crackling of the flames and the distant wail of the approaching police cars. The battle was over, and the lonely boy who'd become a one-man army had claimed his Pyrrhic victory. The gangsters had underestimated him, had laughed at his pain. But in the end, he'd proven them all wrong. He'd shown them that even the smallest, most insignificant person could become a force to be reckoned with. And as the life drained from his body, Marcus felt a grim satisfaction. He'd made his mark on the